He awoke with a start. Blinking syrupy eyes searched the room. Only the bleak unfamiliar white walls stared back. He could not recall where or who he was. What was his name? He sat up in the bed, rubbing his warm clammy brow between thumb and middle finger. Swinging his heavy legs off the side of the bed he took in the room. Realizing that he was in a hospital, he checked his body for signs of injury or surgery. His body felt stiff and sore, but all he found was some bruising. On the adjacent bed neatly folded lay what he imagined was his clothing. A black long-sleeve t-shirt, a pair of grubby-looking khaki chinos, a blue shirt, and on the floor a well-worn pair of brown leather boots. Standing on unsure legs he started to get dressed. Then it hit him. The unnerving smothering silence. He hadn't heard a sound since he'd awoken. Looking out the window he could see it was daylight. Listening intently for a sound, a voice, the squeak of a trolley wheel, a creak of a chair, there was only silence. His body throbbed with fatigue as he wondered how long he'd lain in the bed. Exploring his pockets he prayed for some clue to his identity. Maybe a wallet or some item that might spark a memory. He retrieved a vintage watch, a pair of brown leather gloves, and a crumpled piece of paper. On the paper was written a list of items. Barbed wire, glass bottles, cloth, nails, boards. He questioned the list, trying to figure out why on earth he would have had a need for barbed wire. The other beds in the ward lay abandoned. Looking at the bedside cabinet he noticed a thick layer of dust coating its surface. Swallowing hard, his tongue stuck to the roof of his dry mouth. I need to get out of here, he thought as he strapped the watch to his wrist. Shuffling toward the door, his legs felt like jelly underneath him. He wanted to call for help, but something here wasn't right. Peering out into the hall he saw no one. As he wandered to the nurse's desk at the end of the hall he noticed the grime that covered the walls and floor. The desk was unattended, and it was clear from the thick layer of dust that covered the desktop, keyboard, and clipboard that no one had been here in months, maybe even years. He ran a finger through the grime, bemused at this situation. Slumping into the nurse's chair he tried to piece together how he'd ended up in the hospital. Scratching an itch he found tape on his arm. How had he missed that? Lifting it he saw a red puncture mark. He must have been injected with something. Was it a drip, maybe a drug to make him sleep? Had he been in an accident? Again he checked his body for injuries. His only clue were the bruises that peppered one side of this body. Maybe I fell and hit my head, he thought. Leaning to his side he opened the drawers, searching for anything to eat or drink. They yielded only pens, rubber bands, a pair of earphones, and an unopened packet of sticky notes. His head throbbed from dehydration. He needed a drink. Gathering his strength he stood up. Half staggering he made it to the end of the hall and pushed the lift button. There was no light around the button. The lift remained unmoved. Stepping over to the wall he tried a light switch. No power. After 2 flights of endless stairs he emerged into a central reception area, sweat dripping from his brow. His attention went immediately to something lying on the floor. Tentatively he approached the thing, unsure what he was looking at. As he drew closer there was an involuntary retch from his stomach. On the floor lay the corpse of a police officer. A reddish-black pool of long-dried blood surrounded the body. The entire face of the corpse and intestinal area had been torn away. The floor was smeared with bloody hand and footprints. The crimson trail led to the main entrance door, where several chairs, cabinets, and 2 vending machines had been used to create a makeshift barrier. Noticing the officer still had his gun in his belt he hobbled into the office space behind the reception. Pulling open drawers he finally found what he was looking for. The familiar crinkle of a pack of wipes. Returning to the body he removed one from the packet and in a pinching grip lifted the gun from the officer's belt. Wiping down the gun he tried not to breathe. While the stench was past its worst there was still a vile odor around the withered, crusty corpse. Taking a seat on one of the many reception chairs he wondered how the police officer had met his grisly end. Why hadn't he used his gun in defense? Maybe he hadn't seen the attack coming, he thought. Perhaps it had been an ambush. The thought made him uneasy as his eyes darted around a large waiting area. Thin beams of light broke through the ramshackle barrier, offering uneven splinters of illumination. The smothering dust particles danced in the late morning light. Whatever or whoever had done this was probably long gone. Returning to the corpse he removed an ammo clip and a set of car keys. Checking the clip in the gun he realized that he was familiar with firearms. He knew how to clean and strip the gun in his hand, the make and model. Why he knew that he couldn't say, but he knew he had extensive firearms experience. At that moment a memory flickered into his head. A woman lay still on a bed, her pale skin was cold to the touch. He peered down at the floor, a welling feeling of failure and loss consumed him. He tried to focus on the memory, but the harder he tried to remember, the more the tears flowed. Wiping his face on his sleeve, he put the gun into the small of his back and hobbled toward the barricaded doors. 5 minutes later, sweat dripping from his forehead, he'd managed to shift a vending machine a few inches, just enough to squeeze through the front door. Emerging onto a sea of tarmac, he raised a hand to shield his eyes from the blinding sunlight. In front of him lay a large car park. There was no one in sight. Only 3 cars remained in the parking lot. One of them was a police cruiser. He stood there for a moment, taking a deep breath. A cool breeze blew against his face, the warm sun sending a pleasant shiver down his spine. Making his way over to the cruiser, he peered into the car's side window. There were no signs of violence. Retrieving the keys, he opened the door and sat in the driver's seat. Putting the key in the ignition, he was relieved when the engine started first time. Trying the police radio, he was met with a wall of static. The heat in the car was stifling, so he cranked down the window. A musty smell filled the interior. He wondered if the officer had come to the hospital for treatment, perhaps medicine. Why were the doors barricaded? How had the officer and the attackers gotten in? He scratched at his stubble while looking at his face in the rear-view mirror. Staring back at him was a man in his late 30s, maybe early 40s. Dark blonde hair hung to just above his shoulders. Out of habit, he tucked one side behind his ear.